Mindful self-compassion is relatively new. I'm going to talk to you about who created mindful self-compassion, and I'm going to talk about some of the research behind it. I will talk about some of the components of mindful self-compassion, and then if you're willing, throughout the presentation I have 2 activities I'd like to lead you through so that you can leave with something today. So mindful self-compassion, I'll tell you how I came to be standing in front of you here today. I've worked as a social worker for most of my professional life, and I've worked with families of children with special needs, people in conflict with the law, and a variety of other populations. So mindful self-compassion, the point of it is to meet our suffering with kindness, because we tend not to be very kind to ourselves when we're suffering. We tend to kick ourselves when we're down. And so in my work, I just saw a lot of people suffering. And over several years ago, I became interested in meditation, and this is a bit of a building block for mindful self-compassion. So the 2 people who created this program, Dr. Kristin Neff, she is from the University of Texas, and Dr. Christopher Germer is a clinical psychologist at Harvard Medical. And so a friend of mine, Dr. Bernita Leahy, was going to a mindful self-compassion training, and I told her I was really interested in it, so I kind of hitched a ride with her. So the 2 doctors who created this program spoke in their books about their own pain and suffering that brought them to create this practice. In his 20s, Christopher Germer went to India and started studying meditation. And he, as a Harvard prof, suffers from just agonizing public speaking, which I'm having a little bit of right now. A little bit of that as well. And Kristin Neff, she has done the research on this method, and she was going through a very painful divorce and has a child with autism, and so had a lot of challenges going on while she was working on her doctorate. And so the 2 of them joined together and start working together in 2010, and then they created an organization called the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. And the whole point of it is to get information out to people about how you can change your relationship with yourself, basically. So the work that the center is doing is all over the world. Bernita and I ended up taking the first training that happened in Canada last year, but it is being offered all over the world in different languages. And the most recent post that I got was that they're going to be teaching it in Kenya. Mindful self-compassion is basically compassion turned towards yourself. And right now, the relationship that we tend to have with ourselves is a little more harsh. And the idea is to turn it towards a little more compassion. So there are 3 pillars to mindful self-compassion. First being mindfulness. So being present and being aware of what you're experiencing while you're experiencing it. The second is common humanity. And common humanity is the recognition that we are all human beings, that we all make mistakes, that we all suffer. And it's about remembering that in those moments when we're struggling. And the final pillar is self-kindness. And self-kindness is giving yourself what you need in the moment of suffering, and you need to determine that for yourself. So mindful self-compassion, by combining self-compassion with mindfulness, we can learn to respond to difficult thoughts and feelings with kindness, sympathy, and understanding. So this might sound like a bit of a radical idea because we don't think too much about our relationship with ourselves or how we treat ourselves. But I'd like you to think for one moment about a dear friend that you have who might have had a moment of suffering, a tough time recently. And I just want to just recall that person for a minute, someone who's had suffering. I'd like you now to think about how you responded to that person. I'm thinking you might have used some kind words. You might have given that person a hug. And you might have been soothing them with the intention of easing their pain. Okay? So now, I would like you to recall a moment when you've been suffering. When you have dropped the ball at work, dropped the ball at home, reacted to someone unkindly out of anger, I'd like you to recall in your mind, how did you talk to yourself? Not nice. Yeah. Absolutely. The things that we say to ourselves in our mind, we don't say to other people. Why is that? Why do we do that? So, studies show that by practicing mindful self-compassion, you can enhance your emotional well-being, you can alleviate depression and anxiety. And it's all natural, 100% natural. So why learn self-compassion? Again, studies have shown that it builds resilience, increases our emotional well-being, it leads to compassion for others, it supports a growth mindset, meaning to grow as a human being, as opposed to self-improvement. We talk about self-improvement often, and I'm, a self-improvement junkie. I have a cajillion books at home on my shelf about self-improvement, and no word of a lie, I have a book called Stop Buying Self-Improvement Books and Start Living Your Life. I really have that book. I haven't read it, though. So the final point there is that it promotes self-acceptance and it lessens self-criticism. So I'm going to talk now about the 3 pillars of mindful self-compassion a little bit more. So you've probably heard the term mindfulness a lot in the last few years. It's becoming more and more popular. And this is a quote. There are a lot of definitions out there about what mindfulness is. This is a quote from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is credited with introducing the therapeutic world to mindfulness, the idea of being present in your life. Another quote that I really like, I made reference to earlier, is being aware of what you're experiencing while you're experiencing it, not thinking about it later. What's this interest in mindfulness that seems to be kind of the rage lately? I want you to imagine for a moment what your grandparents' life looked like. Everybody has a sense of what's changed in the last 100 years, right? That's such a small portion of time. We are living in a time in which humanity has never had the amount of pressure, demands on us physically, emotionally, socially. 100 years ago, our grandparents would have had a small circle of friends. I don't think they would have had the telephone yet, would they? Let's say not. They wouldn't have the telephone, they wouldn't have the technology we have. So evolutionary psychologists contend that a huge portion of our mental health issues in our society are because we are not hardwired to be coping in the world we live in. Our bodies are hardwired for 2 generations back, 1 to 2 generations. So standing on a platform at a train station to take a train into town for an hour, to work in a concrete building where you don't have much interaction with your colleagues necessarily, and you go home and you may not even know your neighbor. We're living in a very, very different time. And I think if you think for a moment, what's brought you here? There's some interest in our human experience. There's an interest to find some peace because we're living in very demanding times. Also, anxiety and depression, which I referred to earlier, is rampant in our school systems. Kids are being diagnosed with clinical depression and clinical anxiety disorders. Bernita Leahy in Kamloops is hoping to introduce this to mindfulness, mindful self-compassion, introduce it in Kamloops to the school systems. There's been a mandate, I believe, to include more social emotional learning in curriculum. And Bernita's hoping to do that in Kamloops. All right. So in relation to mindfulness, we get information from the world through our thoughts. We get information from the world through the images, the tastes, physical sensations, smells, and sounds. Our thoughts our bodies are always present wherever we are, but our mind time travels, right? I see people nodding. It's happened to you. It's really hard to stay really present with what's happening in our lives. We spend a lot of time ruminating about the past. He did this to me, she did this to me. We're thinking about the past, or we're worrying about the future. I was worried about this presentation this morning, right? We worry, and if you spend a lot of time ruminating about the past, that can lead to depression. And if you spend a lot of time worrying about the future, that can lead to anxiety. And so you can see the equation about how if we spend a lot of time thinking about the past and present, no wonder that our depression, our anxiety levels are raising. And with the demands from the environment, we're bombarded. The second pillar is common humanity. So seeing our experience as part of the larger human experience rather than isolating or it being abnormal. Failure is part of the learning process, and therefore it's part of being human. So if I said to you, are you a human being? You'd say to me, yeah. Who's presenting this? This woman is asking such a strange question. Of course, you'd say, I'm a human being. Is everybody in this room a human being? As best we know, they are, right? So, and my next question would be, do humans fail? You'd say, of course they do. We understand that. We understand that rationally. But what happens when we personally fail in the moment, if we're attacked, if we've dropped the ball at work, if we're attacked, verbally by someone, we become incredibly egocentric. We become very self-focused. And we don't make that connection to the common humanity. And that's why that's the second pillar of mindful self-compassion. So mindfulness is the first pillar. You need to recognize when you're suffering. I'm going to jump back a little bit to the mindfulness frame. I realized that I didn't mention this. So we need to first recognize that we're suffering. And you think, well, really? Isn't it obvious when we're suffering? The truth is that we get a lot of messages from our culture not to recognize when we're suffering. You know, there are a lot of popular songs, don't worry, be happy, right? If you're talking about a pain or something negative, there's this perception by some people that you're a negative person, right? So we get a lot of messages. The other thing is, aside from the messages that we get in our culture, we often move to, okay, here's a problem, let's solve it. So something's happened, you've dropped the ball, I'm really upset about something, I've failed at something at work. Immediately move into problem solving. But we need to take just one moment to acknowledge and to validate the fact that you're suffering. Wow, you know, oh, this is a moment. This is really tough for me right now. I'm really scared because I dropped the ball, and this is the third time I dropped the ball at work. And so just taking one moment to acknowledge that fear, the pain, whatever it may be. So getting back to the common humanity, failure is part of learning. So like I said, we tend to get very egocentric and think something has gone wrong in the world. How can this happen to me? I was planning to do a perfect presentation and my slides, how can that happen? But that's reality. From the moment we're born, we're learning new things. And to learn something new, failure is inherent in the process. But somehow we take that personally when it happens to us in the moment. The third pillar is self-kindness. And the intention is that we start to change the way we talk to ourselves and that we use care and understanding rather than harsh judgment. And it's also a way of actively soothing and comforting ourselves. So first, I'm going to go through like a bit of an example. So right now, you know, I got upset, a bit worried that, you know, my presentation was going smooth as silk, and I felt worried about that. So first of all, I need to recognize I'm worried. And then just take a moment to acknowledge that. Oh, how embarrassing, I messed up. Take a moment, and then the second is go, you know, it happens to everyone. We all have failures, we all drop the ball, and things happen. There is pain in life. You cannot avoid the fact that there is pain in life. And then self-kindness, you can talk kindly to yourself rather than saying, I can't believe I did that again. What an idiot. Like, I've done it again. Rather than instead say to yourself, you know, these things happen. So self-kindness is about supporting and protecting ourselves. So the physiology of self-compassion. So when we meet our pain with mindful self-compassion, we can activate the mammalian caregiving system in our body. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about the reptilian system that is activated when we initially encounter pain. So the 3 steps that you can do is use physical warmth. You'll probably notice this, that people who are in accidents, often the medics immediately put a blanket on them, right? It's to bring them warmth. And by being given a blanket, that starts to activate your, rather than your fight, flight, or freeze response, it activates your caregiving system, and then all those chemicals in your body change from the fight, flight, or freeze to a more calming, soothing chemicals in your body. So gentle vocalizations and a soothing touch. So one of the things I'm going to be showing you is how to do a self-compassion break. And I just want you to put this in the back of your head. that one of the steps is to use soothing touch with yourself, and it's because when you touch yourself in a soothing way on your arm, your hand over your heart, give your arm a squeeze, whatever that might be for you, it's one of the ways that you activate the caregiving system. I remember years ago hearing, people say, give yourself a hug. And I thought, oh, for goodness sakes. I rolled my eyes, but that's what they were talking about, and you might have heard that before, give yourself a hug. And I think, really? But it does help that, along with the other steps, the physical warmth and the gentle vocalization. So speak kindly to yourself, and I'd like you to think about what you feel comfortable with when I lead you through that mindful self-compassion break. What kind of soothing touch feels right for you? So, misgivings about mindful self-compassion. So, self-compassion is not about self-esteem. Like I said, it's not about self-improvement. It's really actually about self-acceptance, which is a bit of a radical notion in our society because we are very into self-improvement. And anyone can come and borrow any books from my place on self-improvement. I've got a library of it. Self-compassion is not self-pity. It's about meeting your suffering with kindness. There is a notion that it's, you're kind of feeling sorry for yourself. And if you start doing this, that you're going to become a couch potato. And the research shows that it's actually quite the opposite, that when you treat yourself with kindness, when you've failed or had a difficult experience, that the fear of failing starts to become alleviated, because sometimes it can be paralyzing. I'm going to talk freestyle about the fight, flight, and freeze. I don't have this up on the board. So historically speaking, or from an evolutionary perspective, if we were in the jungle and a saber-toothed tiger came towards us, our reptilian brain would kick in, and you would either fight the saber-toothed tiger, you would flight or run away from the saber-toothed tiger, or you'd freeze and hope that it didn't see you. So that's the oldest part of our brain, and we still have that functioning in our brains today. So what happens, though, in a society where we have increased demands on us at work, we have to respond to emails, everything is faster, faster, faster. Our reptilian brain is being triggered, and that fight, flight, or freeze response. That's why sometimes people can be feeling just really overwhelmed. We have all those chemicals coursing through our veins that think this is a life and death situation. And so when instead you respond to, when instead you're doing self-criticism, and this might be the most painful part of suffering, is because that constant niggling, the things that we say to ourselves every day, repeatedly, day in, day out, that really is the crux of a lot of our suffering. So when we have a fight, flight, or freeze situation, rather than running away from a tiger, if you're the one who's attacking yourself, and then you turn internally, right? So then you start self-criticizing yourself. You isolate yourself. And then you also start to become overly identified with the problem, because remember that you've really isolated yourself and you think, how could this happen to me? And we really become focused on the problem that we've created. It becomes part of us rather than something that's happened. So I'm just gonna ask you to go through a little bit of a process of doing a self-compassion break. So the first thing I'd like you to do, if you're willing, is I'll lead you through just some direction on how to bring yourself into presence. So make yourself really comfortable in your seat. And if you feel comfortable, I'll ask you to close your eyes. If not, just lower your gaze, please. And maybe take 1 or 2 deep, cleansing breaths. And just let your breath return to normal now. I'd like you to notice in your mind's eye where your body is in this room. If you envision the room in your mind's eye, where are you sitting? Please start to notice what it feels like with your feet on the ground. Where your body touches the chair. And now I'd like you to tune in to any sounds that you're hearing in the room. And don't seek them out, just let them come to you. You might be hearing sounds outside of the room. And now notice any smells that might be coming to you. Now I'd like you to move kind of internally to your body. Notice, first of all, if there's any unsettling feelings that you're experiencing right now. Any pleasant feelings that you're experiencing right now. Perhaps it's just neutral. Notice how your body is feeling physically. If there's anything that you notice in your body, take your attention to it. And if you can, let it go. Now I'll ask you to start to notice your breath. Notice where it enters your body by your nostrils. Perhaps you notice your breath down in your belly or your chest. Just take a moment to follow your breath. And when your mind wanders, as it will, just bring yourself back to your breath. Now I'll ask you to let go of your attention on your breath. Maybe move your feet around and bring yourself back into the room. And when you're ready, please open your eyes. What was that like? Pardon me? Relaxing? Yes.
I feel warmer.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Just bringing yourself into presence and noticing what's going on in your body. Yeah. So I find in moments when I feel really frazzled that if I can take a couple of moments just to start following my breath, that it brings me back here and now. And it's a lovely tool. So that's bringing yourself into presence. And the next one I wanted to do was just to give you a bit of direction on a self-compassion break. It's something you can do anytime, at all, anywhere, and no one would even know you were doing it. So, a self-compassion break. And you know what's really lovely? The first time you remember this, you're going to go, whoa, because it took a while when I was experiencing pain for me to recall, oh yeah, do this, try this mindful self-compassion thing that I learned. Because we operate on autopilot so much of our lives. And so I remember the first time I did this, and I was out in the world, and something happened, and my head started spinning, my thoughts were, going back, going forwards, into the past, into the future. And then I used this, and it brought me back now. And it transformed, I don't use that word lightly, it transformed my experience. And by practicing this more and more in my life, it has changed the way that I experience my life. And it's been really empowering. So the self-compassion break, the next time that you have something happen to you that is causing you pain. And when I use the word pain and suffering interchangeably, I just want to mention that there's a wide spectrum of pain and suffering, right? Down at this end, there's frustration and being, in traffic, which can usually move along that scale to this end pretty fast. And at this end, there's the loss of a loved one. And each of us in this room has experienced profound pain in our lives, because every human on the planet has experienced that. So I'd like you to take one moment to recall something that you've experienced that is pretty much resolved, but that caused you pain. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would like you to do something about a 3 or 4. So do not dive into the deep end of this pool. Do not pick a 10. If you pick a 3 and it starts to go towards 10, choose something else. So I'll just give you a few seconds to recall something, and you might start to notice, feelings in your body when you start to recall the situation. You might start to remember the feelings that you had, the sensations in your body, some of the thoughts you had. Okay, so please take a moment to recall a painful experience on a scale of 1 to 10, a 3 to 4. So I'd like you to recall it. Think about who was there. Think about what happened. Think about how you responded. Now we're going to be using the soothing touch that I mentioned to you. So first of all, I would like you to, it could be totally discreet. You might just squeeze your hand on your other hand. But I'd like you to use some sort of soothing touch. There is hand over your heart, because our heart center is very powerful, and when we acknowledge it, that can be very effective. You can put your hand over your heart, you can squeeze your leg, give yourself a hug, whatever you feel comfortable with. So I'd like you to hold this situation in mind right now and use whatever soothing touch you feel comfortable doing. And now I'd like you to consider what you needed to hear. What did you need to hear in that moment? And please say it to yourself inside your head. Just firstly, acknowledge how you felt, and then tell yourself what you needed to hear. I'll just give you a few more seconds to finish that up. And when you're ready, please open your eyes. Maybe have a deep cleansing breath now too. All right, lovely. Thank you for that. I had mentioned at the beginning that I wanted you to be able to leave with two things that you'll be able to use. And so bringing yourself into presence and following your breath is one of them. And then this self-compassion break is the second one, because I find this remarkable to be able to use out in my life. Nobody knows, and it actually affects the way I'm experiencing whatever is going on. So practicing self-compassion is like throwing a pebble into the water. It starts a ripple effect in the home, in the workplace, in the school. Your example will encourage others to be more accepting of themselves as well, and the ripple goes on indefinitely. I wonder if you'd be willing to close your eyes once more. I'm asking you to do that, or just lower your gaze. I'd like to read this to you, please. This is a poem by Miller Williams, and it's called The Ways We Touch. Have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. What appears bad manners, an ill temper, or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on down where the spirit meets the bone. So I'd like you to keep your eyes closed for a moment. One moment longer. I'm going to read it again. Have compassion for yourself, even if you don't want it. What appears bad manners, an ill temper, or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going on down where the spirit meets the bone. All right. Please open your eyes when you're ready. And so that concludes my presentation on mindful self-compassion. I've got resources listed up here. I've got the two books This is the book that was written by Dr. Christopher Germer. The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, Freeing Yourself from Destructive Thoughts and Emotions. And then the other one was written by Kristen Neff, and it's called Self-Compassion, the Power of Being Kind to Yourself, the Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. There's the contact information for the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion in San Diego. They're doing some fantastic work throughout the world. And then Kristen and Christopher's web addresses. So I will leave that up for a moment, but I want to take this opportunity to say thank you so very much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I hope that now that you've had a bit of an introduction to mindful self-compassion, that perhaps you try one of the two activities, both the activities that I've mentioned. And I hope that your mindful self-compassion practice will flourish. Thank you for your time.